The voicemail came at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, and by the time the woman from the Chicago escrow office reached the words co-owner on title, the coffee in my hand had already gone cold. Her voice stayed careful as she asked whether I would be joining Graham Vale at Thursday's closing for the West Loop loft, because the second name listed beside his did not match mine. I replayed the message twice, then called back before my pulse could settle. She thanked me for returning the call so quickly, then confirmed the file showed Graham Vale and Celia Draper as the buyers, with earnest money traced to a marital account requiring clarification before closing documents could be finalized. I asked for the purchase price, and when she told me the loft was under contract for $425,000, I opened my banking app and watched the balance sit there like a dare. The transfer history loaded in a clean vertical line, one vague withdrawal after another, each labeled with language polished enough to sound normal. I did not cry, because the screen had already done something more useful than heartbreak. It had arranged the last 18 months into a pattern I could finally see. Graham had asked me to trust the joint account, wait on opening my own studio, and stop treating every financial question like a problem. And now a stranger's voicemail had handed me the one fact he could not explain away. Another woman's name was sitting beside my husband's on a loft bought with money I had spent a decade earning. And by the time I set my mug down, I knew silence was over for me completely. I was 38. 14 years into a career designing exhibition spaces for donor galas, museum openings, and cultural launches, and I had spent years learning how to make rooms carry emotion without wasting a single line. Before Graham, that instinct had built me a name strong enough that clients remembered how my spaces felt after they forgot the floral budgets and seating charts. After Graham, the work still moved through my hands, but the ambition attached to it began getting trimmed back in neat, reasonable pieces. He never asked me to disappear all at once, which would have been obvious, harder to defend, and too clumsy for a man who preferred control dressed up as concern. Instead, he kept offering smaller corrections, telling me it was smarter to stay steady, that opening my own studio right now would be risky, that I was reading too much into normal financial delays. Each sentence landed softly enough to pass for partnership, and that was what made it effective for longer than I want to admit. 3 years earlier, he had suggested the joint account as a cleaner system for household planning, and I had transferred most of my savings because the proposal sounded practical inside a marriage already full of shared schedules. Then the balance became something he monitored more closely than I did. The paperwork became something he was already handling, and every question I raised met the same polished reassurance that nothing was wrong. By the time that escrow officer left me a voicemail with Celia Draper's name attached to a loft, I already knew the pattern because I had been living inside it. The account history on my phone showed the money gone, and that evidence did more than expose one purchase because it pinned every earlier compromise to something concrete at last. Graham had not talked me out of my studio because timing was bad, or because the market was uncertain, or because marriage required patience from the more ambitious person. He had been moving me away from my own future while using my stability to build one I was never meant to see. I stayed at my desk and kept pulling on the thread the escrow officer had handed me, because Celia Draper on a loft deed felt expensive, but it still felt explainable. What stopped feeling explainable was Graham's firm appearing in the paperwork around a museum fundraising installation they had recently branded as an in-house creative win. A phrase in the project language caught me hard enough that I opened an old folder from my own archive and started comparing lines. The concept description matched a donor showcase proposal I had built the year before, right down to the emotional sequencing I used when I wanted a room to feel intimate before it felt impressive. I called Lena Brooks, because she had moved through that world long enough to remember what firms displayed, what designers circulated privately, and what details belonged to whom. When I asked whether she had seen Graham's showcase materials, her pause lasted just long enough to tell me the answer had been sitting in front of other people for months. She finally gave me the part that mattered. That, yes, those boards had been shown publicly under Graham's firm name. And no, She had never forgotten how they looked. I pulled my original files onto the screen, checked the dates, checked the exported drafts, checked the proposal language, and there it was again. My work moving through his business, wearing somebody else's credit. The affair was still there, ugly and obvious, but it had shifted into its proper place, because Celia Draper was not the deepest wound in front of me now. Theft was. That night I called my sister Mara and told her only the parts I could prove. The loft deed, the missing money, the showcase boards carrying my work under Graham's firm. She arrived with her coat still on, sat at my kitchen table, and listened without softening any of it into confusion, because the bank history and dated design files had already done that work for us. By the time midnight moved past the stove clock, we had separated everything into clean stacks that made the damage legible instead of emotional. One pile held the account withdrawals tied to property money. Another held the showcase materials Lena had remembered. And a third held my original files with export dates Graham could not argue with. Mara worked the way archivists work. Calm hands. Exact labels. No appetite for drama when chronology could do more. And watching her sort my marriage into evidence steadied me faster than comfort would have. We copied statements, saved screenshots, logged dates, and backed the hard drive to a second device, because every document on that table had already earned its place. 2 days later, I met Tess Caldwell in her office and gave her the version without ornament. That marital money had funded a loft with Celia Draper, and my design work had been used to secure commercial business. She moved through the papers, stopped at the account transfers, then at the attribution pages, and told me the same thing both sets of evidence were already suggesting, that these were not side issues. In Illinois, money moved out of a marriage for a concealed purpose could matter sharply in divorce, and work used publicly without permission needed its own legal response before anyone started pretending it had been a misunderstanding. Tess told me not to drain accounts, not to conflict Graham, and not to confuse movement with strategy, because timing mattered once records were this clear. I left her office with a plan that matched the evidence exactly. Keep the house quiet. Keep building the chronology. And let every next step come from something documented. By then, I was no longer trying to understand what my husband had done to me. I was building the file that would decide what it cost him. For 6 weeks, I kept the house exactly as Graham expected it. Dinners on time. Weekend plans intact. My face untroubled. My questions small enough to pass as routine. While he moved through our life, believing the danger had not reached him yet, Mara and I kept widening the record until his secrecy started reading like structure instead of luck. Every transfer from the joint account found its place beside a date, a purpose, a recipient, or an omission that narrowed what he could later deny. The West Loop loft was only the first clean line, because the deeper review exposed a second layer of spending routed through an LLC. Graham controlled and never disclosed to me. That paper trail tied marital funds to a furnished studio, short-term rental payments, and staging costs that made no sense inside the version of our finances he had been selling at home. By the third week, the account history no longer looked messy or complicated, which is how deception survives, and had started looking deliberate, which is how it begins to fail. Lena kept sending material as she found it. Event booklets, recap images, internal credits, and archived promotional language that carried my design instincts under Graham's branding as if authorship were just another editable field. Buried in the email chain was Celia Draper. Not accidental, not peripheral, but fully present around schedules, materials, and presentation timing in ways that made ignorance impossible to believe. By the end of the 6th week, I was still setting plates across from my husband at dinner. But under that ordinary table sat a complete chronology of money, work, and intention. And it was almost ready. 2 weeks before I planned to move. Graham came home early with a bottle of wine and the bright Mayad, loose confidence he only wore after closing business. He set takeout on the counter, kissed my cheek, and told me his firm had just landed a major cultural sponsorship account downtown that afternoon for us. Then he poured 2 glasses and gave me the version I had heard for years. That this was for us. That we were finally getting ahead. He talked about neighborhoods, easier schedules, and the day I would not have to work so hard. And every promise landed against evidence already waiting upstairs. The same hands lifting that wine had signed transfers into hidden accounts, and the same mouth calling me his future had helped erase my name for profit. I watched him smile across our kitchen and understood that Graham was celebrating a life built on my money, my work, and my silence without apology. So I smiled back and let him keep talking. Because the chronology Mara and I had built was complete enough that I no longer needed truth from him. He lifted his glass and told me, "We're almost where we always said we'd be." And I touched mine to his before taking a sip. By the time dinner was over, I had chosen my day. And he was still sitting across from me, believing warmth could cover theft at all. Monday began at 8 with a call to the escrow officer who had left the voicemail that opened everything. And this time, I gave her the part missing from the file. I told her the West Loop loft was under dispute because marital funds had been used without my knowledge or consent. And by the end of that call, the closing was no longer moving forward. 1 hour later, Tess Caldwell filed to preserve the assets tied to those transfers. And the morning stopped belonging to Graham before he even knew it had started. At 10, the intellectual property lawyer working with Tess sent formal notice to Graham's firm that my design work had been used commercially without permission and that every relevant document had to be preserved. The demand went where it needed to go. Not only to Graham, but to the people inside the company who handled records. Because concealment gets harder once more than one desk is forced to see it. At 11, I sent Graham an email with the subject line, "I know everything." Then attached the escrow dispute, the asset filing, the design claim, and a summary of the money trail he had spent 18 months hiding. The body of the message was short because the attachments were already carrying the weight, and the only sentence that mattered was, "Do not contact me directly." I sent the same record to the firm's internal leadership 30 minutes later, then walked through the house with one bag and took only what had always been mine, my passport, my laptop, my hard drive, and the paper trail. By noon, I was gone. And while my phone began lighting up with Graham's name over and over, the chronology Mara and I built had already reached every place his charm could not follow. I never answered a single call, because the timing had done exactly what Tess promised good timing could do once the record was clean. The loft was stalled. The assets were under review. The stolen work was no longer buried inside branding language, and Graham was waking up inside consequences that had been assembled quietly around him for weeks. When I stepped into the street with that one bag in my hand, the marriage behind me still looked intact from the outside, but his control of it was already over. What followed did not collapse in one dramatic afternoon, because once the filings were made, the damage moved the way documented damage moves in real life, steadily and publicly. Financial Review confirmed that nearly $200,000 in marital funds had been redirected through accounts and entities Graham never disclosed, which made every earlier reassurance read like planning from him entirely. The West Loop loft stalled. Celia Draper lost the handoff she had been expecting, and the furnished studio tied to Graham's LLC became part of discovery and proceedings that followed. His firm had to preserve records, explain the false attribution, and answer for why my design language had circulated as proprietary work after carrying my timestamps all along. By the time negotiations began, the facts were too organized to charm away, and even Graham's business side understood this was no private marital misunderstanding on any level. Tess kept the process narrow and exact, and that mattered, because consequences attached more cleanly when each person faced the specific paper trail with their name on it directly. Nothing exploded, but everything gave way in order: the money, the property, the credit, the story Graham had been telling. and the future he had assigned me inside it. 6 months after that Monday, I sat in Tess Coldwell's conference room and signed the final settlement that returned my contributions, corrected the record, and closed the marriage for good. The numbers mattered because the money came back with recognition attached. Not as pity, not as compromise, but as proof that what Graham used had belonged to me first. I left with enough to buy the brick townhouse in Lincoln Square that I had once pointed out to Graham, and enough certainty never to ask permission again in peace. Lena brought me into the studio as a real partner, not a hidden contributor, and the first announcement carried my name exactly where my work had always deserved it. Clients I had not heard from in years reached out within days, and each email felt cleaner than vindication, because none of them asked who I had been married to. A trade publication that once printed the wrong credit requested an interview on independent exhibition practice. And this time, I spoke under my own name without shrinking it. The healing did not arrive as a revelation, because I had already lived through the sharpest part, but as a series of ordinary mornings that stayed mine at last. Mara came over on weekends to help strip old wallpaper from the back bedroom, and we ate pizza on the floor while my new plans dried beside us. I drew every line for that townhouse myself, and when my pen moved across the page, the work felt less like recovery than authorship fully restored. When the interview ran, I talked about ownership, authorship, and building a practice that could not be folded into someone else's ambition just because I loved them once too much. That was the part I understood best in the end. Graham had only reached the money, the files, the access, never the mind that made them valuable in any room. By the time I signed my name across the townhouse plans, clean and steady, I was not standing in the ruins of my life, but above them for good now. Thank you for staying with me through this story.